The Hidden Key, written and read by Mike Hayes. As the great man famously said, "It may not be the beginning of the end, but it is the end of the beginning. So raise your glass and congratulate yourself on this achievement." So said Professor Anne Morrison at the press conference called to announce the results of DNA analysis of fragments of bone taken from the skeleton recovered from under a car park in Leicester, and now confirmed to the interested world as the remains of Richard III, the loser at Bosworth in 1485. Even though on national television, and with her usual casual academic look that many described as unkempt, the matronly professor maintained her usual staid persona, but inwardly was as excited and as smug as any child would be at bettering a sceptical opponent on a contentious issue. She, and it has to be said, many others of like persuasion had been proved right. But finding the remains and, within the limitations of early 21st century science, proving the identity was just half the job. The mortal whose remains they had found had a reputation, a bad reputation, none more so than in present times. And her next mission, as yet announced to her almost sycophant co-workers, all fully paid Ricardians, was to prove the monarch's accusers wrong. Even as she quaffed the champagne with pasta on the canapé, courtesy of the television producer, Professor Morrison's thoughts were already focused on the next phase. Befitting someone of her stature as a learned historian and top-class researcher, she was thinking of a little-known, largely ignored ancient chest logged on the inventory of Leicester Cathedral, but languishing far from the public gaze in the darkest recesses of the crypt of one of the city's finest and least used buildings. She prided herself on claiming to have the best national record of Richard III artifacts, one of which she claimed was this chest, even though, and even for her, its history is only certain from that very dire night, 15th of November 1940, when Coventry Cathedral was all but obliterated by the attentions of the German Luftwaffe. There is a certain irony in the fact that the cathedral had only come into being in 1918, the last year of the Great War. Until then, it had been known as St. Michael's, a fine 14th century Gothic church, one of the finest in the land. The chest in question, it is thought, had been in that church since its completion, probably because of its position below ground level and covered by much ecclesiastical bric-a-brac. The chest survived the air raid and was removed to Leicester Cathedral, an even younger sibling dating from just 1926-27. But its history preceded that of Coventry by at least 2 centuries. It was intended to take the chest from Leicester, itself a likely target for air raid, to the safer confines of the repository in North Wales. But its weight and design, and the fact that 2 important parts of the chest were not recognised by the recovery team and joined the metal mountain as scrap, meant that it had remained at Leicester's St. Martin's Cathedral for the duration. On a murky November afternoon in 2012, Prof. Morrison, with time on her hands and a need to get indoors from the incessant rain, used the cathedral as a shelter, and in her usual authoritarian manner, introduced herself to a young verger and asked about antiquities. He readily suggested a visit to the crypt and stood silently as the learned historian cast about for anything that was worthy of her further interest. In time, her eyes lighted on a chest, drawn to her close attention by the carved figure of a young heart on the only visible side. She inquired of her young guide what it was, and his easy reply was, "Oh, it's known as the Coventry box, but it is so heavy it's not easily moved. It just stays there." "Why Coventry?" came the direct response, to which the verger simply, "I don't honestly know." The learned lady was not one for holding back, particularly where there were loose lines of engagement, and suggested to her companion that they move some of the other stuff obscuring her view and have a closer look at it. Ever compliant, the verger did exactly what she had suggested in a command form. Without any thought for her clothes and shoes, she dropped to the floor and started to examine with eyes and fingers the exterior of the chest. "The light is poor here. Be a good chap, get me a torch if you will." "From where?" was the surprised reply. "I don't know. Some candles will do. You must have plenty of those." Almost relieved to be released from the woman's presence, he turned and left to do as he was bid. He returned and had several stub ends of candles that had done service at the altar, but were now considered not quite right for public display. What the increasingly excited woman was examining was about 4 feet long and probably 2 by 2 feet wide and tall. Not that large, she thought. So why is it so heavy to move? Probably full of plate, she thought. Without being an expert on wood, she had judged it was probably oak, heavily stained to almost a smooth finish. Most noticeable were the 3 iron bands that ran horizontally around the frame. From the 3 sides she could examine, the band had been cast from one long piece of metal and secured by prominent square-headed screws or perhaps bolts. The upper and lower bands were plain, with an orange peel feel to her fingertips. The middle bands carried a seemingly endless array of letters with no obvious start or end point. She wondered if the 4th, as yet unseen band was also figured. The domed lid of the chest was immaculate, and as she ran her fingers over the top and 2 ends, she felt no joints or breaks. "Must be carved from a single piece of wood," she silently mused. She felt down the back, still unseen, face, and ran her fingers along the lid. No external hinge, she noted mentally. Finally, her attention was drawn to the 2 apparently identical locks on the face nearest her. "Don't suppose you have the key, do you?" To her utter amazement, the young man answered, "Well, yes, we do, but it doesn't work." She almost spat out the words. "Well, if it doesn't work, it isn't the correct key, and you don't have the key to it." She peered at her watch, a most manly-sized object, and said, "Damn, I have to go. I will be back." When? Soon. The verger's emotions were delicately balanced with relief and anguish. The next morning, Prof. Morrison was at her desk by 7 a.m. By 8 a.m., she had arranged a meeting with the Dean of St. Martin's. By 9 o'clock, she had arranged a meeting with a senior endoscopy consultant at Leicester Royal Infirmary, cancelled a tutorial, and left for the car park site to discuss further business with the TV people. On her return to the cathedral, she was met by the dean, who handed her a very substantial key in a finely stitched leather shield. Pushing her luck, she asked if there was any WD-40 available. She suggested that perhaps the lock would work with a key, but after all this time might need some lubrication and persuasion. A nearby cleaner was sent to acquire the said item. On her return, the professor and dean went down to the crypt and to the chest. He stood a respectable distance away as she sprayed both locks, rotating the can as she did to get as deep a penetration as possible. She inserted the key into the left-hand lock and turned it anti-clockwise. There was a little purchase, but no sensation of unlocking. Undeterred, she withdrew the key and tried the other lock. Perhaps because the lubricant had spread further, or perhaps because she applied more pressure, the key turned and there was a definite sound of movement from the lock. With growing confidence, she turned the key clockwise and anti-clockwise, and with a smug satisfaction remarked, "There, a woman's touch." The Dean did not respond. Satisfied that the one lock was open, she withdrew the key, inserted it into the left-hand lock and turned it anti-clockwise. An initial slight resistance, but then it turned and the clicking sound was repeated. At this, the Dean volunteered to lift the lid, but she was not to be denied this moment and said, "No, it's dusty. Let me have a go." She was no frail being, but the lid did not budge. He tried and failed. They tried together, but the chest would not open. What they didn't appreciate was that despite their antiquity, the locks were not the simple tongue and slot mechanism. Instead, there was a primitive shooting bolt system, a forerunner of the modern system beloved of conservatory salesmen. But more than that, the locks were interlinked, so that as one key opened or closed the lock it was in, connecting bars did the reverse action to the other lock. So the young Virgil was correct. It was the correct key, but it didn't work. But Anne Morrison had prepared for this, so it has to be Plan B, she informed the Dean. His response was predictable. "I'll have to get the bishop's permission, and perhaps he has to get higher authority. Leave it to you. You know what has to be done. I'll go and set the wheels in motion." She handed him the key, wiped her hands dry of lubricant, said she would be in touch, and left. The Dean, like the Virgin before him, was only half relieved. Unchanged, but mentally refreshed, she met with Mr. Prasad, surgeon at the infirmary. He listened with interest to her story, but made it clear that he could not help in the way she wanted. The equipment was not his to lend, but he gave her the business card of the salesperson who had supplied the hospital. He pointed out that with the TV coverage of the Richard story, the company might be very willing to help her. Product placement, he grinned. He then volunteered the hospital's phone, "Ring at once." She did. She almost floated on air as she left the hospital. 3 weeks passed before she heard again from the Dean. "Yes, permission has been given to remove one bolt and gain access to the interior." A further 3 weeks passed before anything substantial happened. Then, early on a Wednesday morning, Professor Morrison, the Dean, a cathedral handyman, a television camera and crew, and 2-man industrial endoscopy team assembled in the floodlit crypt. The first step was the handyman. The choice of which bolt had already been made. He had very few tools with him. After all, he had only to withdraw and replace a single bolt. His first choice of tool fitted the bolt head, but gave him no leverage. So he tried a simple adjustable spanner with a foot-long extension bar. He was not a frail being, but got no movement whatsoever. Someone suggested a car wheel nut spanner, but that was dismissed. "Try a turn clockwise to start," someone suggested. The embarrassed, sweating man did, and there was a slight movement and a creaking sound. He readjusted his body, and millimeter by millimeter the bolt was coaxed from its position. Finally, an unthreaded portion appeared, and the man handed the 3-inch bolt to the Dean. The man made way for one of the machine specialists, who proceeded to thread a very fine line into the bolt space. It only entered the length of the bolt. "Pass me a light," he demanded as he kneeled to peer into the hole. "There's an inner lining. Looks like lead. Pass the small drill, 2 mil bit." The Dean blanched. The technician with the drill sensed his application and calmly said, We'll seal it, don't worry. The lead lining was no match for the drill, and within seconds the bit was through and being reversed out. Immediately the bit was drawn, a fine plastic sheath wire was inserted, and the man at the controls and laptop screen said so matter-of-factly, "Okay then, here goes, camera on." Instantly the screen flickered and lit up. Professor Morrison's first glimpse must have been the most disappointing moment in her life. A grey, shadowy, flickering screen full of nothing. The technician in charge altered his seating position, fiddled with some buttons and switches, and said, "Right, what have we got?" The screen was brighter, clearer, and one was aware of the camera tip moving about in the box. The first image was that of a skull, not large, but clean and without any apparent damage. The camera moved and a second skull came into view. The operator spent some time sharpening the images, and a darker image appeared at the base of the second skull. "It looks as if that one is resting on something. Let's go in closer." He expertly zoomed in on the object, sharpened the focus, and exclaimed, "It's only a key," was his dispirited reply. Prof. Morrison's quiet response was, "It could be very important, if only we could get it out. No chance with this rig, but it can be done." The dean coughed. The technician made several more sweeps with the camera, but nothing else was revealed. "Is that it then? Can we shut off and close up now?" asked the drill man. The prof politely answered, "Yes, you've done so well, thank you." The camera specialist disconnected all his equipment. The drill man sealed the tiny hole with silicone sealant. The handyman replaced the screw, wiped the chest with a rag, and the group left the crypt. As they parted company, the cameraman shouted to the prof, "I'll clean things up a bit and email the film to you tomorrow." Only one person was excited, and she didn't show it, but her head was spinning. A key and two medium-sized skulls. How very, very interesting. She was at her desk by 7 next morning, checked her list of emails, but the camera results were not yet through, so she grudgingly made a start on the unopened paper mail and soon got engaged with the problems and solutions it contained. 2 hours had passed before she tried again, but this time the film flickered to her screen and she scrolled up and down and from left to right. She knew her limitations as a forensic anatomist, so focused on the key. The handle was visible, and so was the pattern, and it looked very like the one she had used days before, but with no success. Then it struck her. The skull was rested on the key, and the visible bit was similar, probably identical to the one they had, she reasoned. To be under the skull, there must be an extension to the stock of the key. Where can I get a replica of this key made? The press and TV coverage of the discovery under the car park opened so many doors to requests from university staff for simple things. "Make a key like this one, but a longer stock? Sure, call by tomorrow. We'll have it ready. Give us a mention, miss." And so it was that Professor Morrison entered the crypt with a 21st century copy of a 15th century original. The dean supervised her first attempt, which was a failure. The stock was too long, and the key was not engaging with the lock. "Have you a saw?" was her ridiculous question to the dean, but it worked. "I'll get one of the workmen." Fortunately, not the one from the day of filming, but one who was glad to be called away from his current work and entered into the spirit of opening the chest with pleasure. He understood what he had to do and volunteered that because he didn't actually know the accurate length, he would take millimeters off at a cut. After cutting, he filed a raw edge. The prof was so impressed, but time urgent. After 3 such cuts, the new key engaged with the lock, and the key cutter was astute enough to remark, seems as if it's pressing against something. He tried to turn it first clockwise and then anti-clockwise. Nothing happened. Try this key in the other lock without taking the new one out, suggesting the prof. The disbelieving handyman did as he was told. It turned, and as she expected it would, but there were two discernible clicks. Let's try the lid, she said. The dean and she tried together, but the lid was stuck tight by years of varnish. The handyman, anxious to prolong his time with these two eccentrics, suggested he get some fine tools to clean away the varnish to make raising the lid possible. The dean suggested coffee while the man undertook the task. Professor Anne Morrison agreed and walked with the dean to his office, and just to break the ice said, "That's smart, hiding the key inside the box it opens, and I think I know why it was done." "Oh," said the dean, "milk? Just a drop." How do pathologists identify skulls these days? Small skulls, young skulls.